The wind came across Marlow Ridge like something alive, a wall of copper-colored sand a half-mile wide, swallowing fence posts, swallowing barns, swallowing 30 years of a community's effort to coax a living from cracked earth that had stopped giving anything back. By the time it reached the Caldwell place, 3 farms had already vanished under 6 feet of drift. Trucks sat abandoned on the county road, children were pulled inside and the windows taped shut. Old Walt Pruitt filmed it from his porch, certain he was finally about to watch his neighbor's 11 years of foolishness disappear in under a minute. Instead, the storm did something nobody in 3 counties had ever seen a sandstorm do. It slowed. Right at the edge of Henry Caldwell's tree line, the wind that had just erased 100 acres of farmland seemed to lose its nerve. Sand that had been moving at 40 miles an hour piled itself into soft, harmless drifts 100 yards out from his trees, and stopped. Almost as if it had run into a wall nobody else could see. The same men who had laughed at Henry for 11 straight years stood at the edge of his property afterward, staring at trees that should not exist, rooted in soil that should not hold them, watching a desert decide, for reasons no one could explain, to leave one stubborn old farmer's land alone. Pruitt lowered his phone, hands shaking slightly. "How," he muttered to no one, "is that even possible?" Nobody answered him. Nobody could. If you've ever been laughed at for believing in something nobody else could see, stay with this one all the way to the end. Subscribe if patience has ever been your only weapon. Hit like for everyone who kept planting after the world told them to quit. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Henry Caldwell was 63 years old, and most of Marlow Ridge had long ago decided he didn't talk much because he didn't have much to say. They were wrong. He didn't talk because he was always listening to something else. The give of the soil beneath his boots, the particular hush before wind changed direction, the half-second pause birds made before deciding a place was safe to land. His wife, Adaize, used to tease that he could hear things grow. He never argued with her. He kept walking his land at first light, the way he had for nearly 4 decades, reading a story most of his neighbors had given up trying to read at all. Marlow Ridge sat deep in the dry belt, the kind of place where rain had become more rumor than expectation. Wells that had served 3 generations now pulled up grit before they pulled up water. The old Hendricks place to the north had stood empty for 6 years, its barn slowly vanishing beneath a dune that grew a little taller every season. Crops that once stood chest-high now struggled past the ankle, when they came up at all. A haze of dust hung permanently over the county, like the land itself was holding its breath and waiting for permission to exhale. Everyone on the ridge was losing the same fight against the same encroaching sand. Henry was the only one who'd stopped fighting it the way everyone else had. When Henry began clearing a half-acre of dune to plant trees, Pruitt didn't bother hiding his laughter. "Nothing's grown out there since before my daddy was born," he said, leaning against the fence with his arms crossed. "You'd get a better return burying that money straight in the hole." Henry only nodded, the way he nodded at most things people said to him, and kept digging. For 3 full seasons, the ridicule had plenty of evidence on its side. Saplings browned at the tips within weeks. Several collapsed outright in the first brutal heat wave. The crowd at the general store took to calling that scrubby half-acre Caldwell's Folly, and somehow it was funny to them every single time they said it. Even his own son, Daniel, drove out from the city to ask him to stop. "Dad, you're 63. You're spending money we don't have on trees that won't grow, in dirt that's killed everything anybody's ever tried to put in it. People are talking and not kindly." "Let them talk," Henry said quietly. "The land isn't talking back to them, it's talking to me." What nobody else on Marlow Ridge knew was that Henry had been listening to that ground long before he ever planted a single seed. Years earlier, walking the dunes before sunrise, he'd noticed something most people never stayed outside long enough to see: a faint silvering of moisture across one narrow band of sand, gone within an hour of daybreak. But there, every single morning, in the exact same stretch of ground, he'd noticed wiry clumps of saltbush clinging on a season longer than anything growing around them, right along that same band. He'd noticed grasshoppers gathering there, in numbers that made no sense for soil the whole county had agreed was dead. An old county survey, yellowed and half-eaten by silverfish, sat folded in his grandfather's desk drawer. It described that same narrow stretch of land, decades before the wells ran dry, as a seasonal seep, water moving somewhere beneath the surface, old and slow, and mostly forgotten by everyone but the page itself. Henry didn't fully understand the mechanism behind any of it. He didn't need to. He trusted what the land kept steadily showing him, even when it whispered instead of shouted. The first tree to survive that brutal opening season was an unremarkable mesquite, half dead and leaning hard to one side, that everyone assumed would be gone by spring. It wasn't. By its second year, Henry noticed something stranger still. The soil directly beneath its canopy stayed cool to the touch, a full hour after sunrise, long after the open sand around it had already started to bake underfoot. Dew gathered there and lingered, fine silver beads clinging to blades of grass that had no business surviving in a county this parched. The wind itself began behaving differently. Where it once scoured straight across his land in a single punishing line, it now seemed to stumble when it reached his young trees, breaking apart, slowing, dropping its grit instead of carrying it forward toward the fields beyond. Insects returned first, then small brown birds nobody had seen on the ridge in years, building low nests in the mesquite's crooked branches. Wildflowers Henry didn't remember planting pushed up through sand that had stood bare since before his son was born. Every answer only opened another question. Why here? Why now? Why him, of all the stubborn farmers who had tried and failed before? Then came the drought year, the worst the region had seen in 4 decades. Wells across Marlow Ridge dropped to mud. Henry's savings dropped right alongside them. He sold off half his small herd of cattle just to keep buying saplings nobody else believed would ever take root. A summer sandstorm tore through that same year and ripped out a third of his young trees by their roots. The crowd at the store didn't even bother hiding their satisfaction. Should have quit 2 years ago, somebody said, loud enough on purpose for it to carry. Adeyeze found him standing in the wreckage at dusk, staring at broken trunks instead of standing trees. Maybe they're right, she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was exhaustion, the kind that builds slowly from watching someone you love absorb the same humiliation season after season after season. Henry didn't answer for a long moment. Then he reached down, picked his shovel back up, and started digging again. The ones still standing, he said, are standing for a reason. I just haven't figured out what it is yet. 2 years later came the storm that opened this very story. The one that should have erased what was left of Caldwell's Folly, the same way it erased 3 of his neighbors' farms that same afternoon. Instead, his trees held their ground, and the sand, inexplicably, slowed and settled 100 yards out, as if the desert itself had simply changed its mind about where its border was supposed to fall. For the first time in 11 long years, nobody at the general store was laughing. Word reached the State Agricultural Extension Office within the week. Dr. Naomi Castellanos, a restoration ecologist who had spent her career chasing desertification across 3 continents, drove out the following Tuesday, not because she believed in miracles, but because what she'd heard didn't match anything from her years of training, and that bothered her far more than simple skepticism ever could. She wasn't alone for long. A hydrologist named Reyes arrived the next week with a soil auger and a list of questions longer than his arm. A desert forestry specialist flew in from out of state after reviewing satellite imagery that, frankly, didn't make sense to him either. They dug, they measured, they tested moisture content layer by layer through the soil profile, tracked wind speed across Henry's tree line with handheld anemometers, and mapped the underground seep his grandfather's old survey had described decades before any of them had been born. Henry walked the land beside them, answering each question in his usual unhurried way, more curious about their instruments than proud of anything they might find. What they uncovered, piece by careful piece, was not magic. It was patience, expressed as biology. 11 years of root systems had patiently laced themselves through the dune, binding sand that had spent decades with nothing at all to hold it in place. That tangled root structure had slowed wind speed at ground level just enough that wind-borne sand began dropping its load before it ever reached the open fields beyond. Exactly what Pruitt had watched happen with his own eyes during the storm. Beneath the canopy, fallen leaves and bark had slowly built a thin layer of organic matter that the bare dune had never had, letting the soil hold on to moisture instead of shedding it straight back into dry air. That trapped moisture fed the very seep Henry's grandfather had once written about, drawing it slowly back up toward the surface instead of letting it disappear forever into deeper ground. The cooler soil Henry had noticed years earlier wasn't coincidence at all. It was the trees steadily building their own small, stable microclimate, 1 degree and 1 root at a time, season after season, until the math of an entire ecosystem had gradually turned in their favor. "You didn't beat the desert," Dr. Castellanos told him, looking out at the tree line with something close to wonder. "You simply gave it something to hold on to again." The change that followed wasn't sudden. It was the kind of change that takes an entire community a while to even notice is happening around them. Native grasses spread along the edges of Henry's land, where bare dunes had stood for a generation. Shrubs filled in behind them. Birdsong became an ordinary part of mornings on the ridge again, instead of a memory older residents only described to their grandchildren. The air itself carried less grit. Dust storms that once buried the county road now broke apart at the edge of Henry's trees long before they ever reached town. The dune itself was changing too. Cross-checking her team's ground measurements against the archived satellite imagery, Dr. Castellanos confirmed what the numbers already suggested. The mountain of loose sand that had once swallowed the Hendricks barn whole was measurably smaller than it had been 5 years earlier, settling, compacting, and losing ground to grass a little more with each passing season. The desert wasn't advancing on Marlow Ridge anymore. For the first time in anyone's memory, it was retreating. Neighboring farms began to feel the difference too. Slightly cooler mornings, slightly steadier soil underfoot, a little more green creeping in along the borders closest to Caldwell land. Pruitt was the first to ask Henry for cuttings. He didn't apologize outright, that was never his way, but he showed up at dawn one morning with a thermos of coffee and asked, quietly, how to start. Henry handed him saplings without a single word about Caldwell's Folly, without reminding him of 11 years of laughter at the store. He showed Pruitt where to dig. One by one, other farms on the ridge followed. Some asked outright forgiveness. Most just started planting and let that be enough on its own. Henry never once said he'd told them so. He didn't need to. The trees were already saying it for him, one root at a time. On a quiet morning the following spring, Henry found his granddaughter crouched at the edge of the tree line, watching a single line of ants move in formation through a crack in the bark that nobody else had noticed. "Why are they doing that, Grandpa?" He crouched down beside her instead of answering right away, the way he always did, letting her keep looking a little longer. "I don't know yet," he said, "but you noticed. That's the part that actually matters." He smiled then, watching her watch the ground the exact same way he once had, and understood, finally, what he'd actually spent 11 hard years growing on that dune. It wasn't trees. It was the habit of paying attention to a world that's always trying to tell you something, long before anyone else around you is ready to listen.